Okay, the live stream is on. So now volunteers and chairs, judges, you can start with the debate. Thank you very much.
All right, welcome to the quarterfinals of Macau Online WSDC 2021. Before we begin, can I make sure that all members of Team Proposition, Team Canada are here? Can I also make sure all members of Team Opposition, Team China are here?
Hello, we're all fully present.
Great. Then with that being said, can I check if all judges are here? Judges can introduce themselves in the order in which they appear on the tabby cat, starting with Judge Aditya.
We lost access to the motion clarification that was given to us earlier in the prep round. So would it be possible for anyone to just paste that in the chat? Because it was pasted in our chat before, but we didn't realize the chat would disappear. I don't know if anyone has access to that. Perfect. Thanks so much.
All right. I think Judge Aditya just got here. So we can go through the introductions for the judges, starting with Judge Aditya.
Hi all, I'm Aditya. I'm from the USA. I'll be your chair for this round. With me are my excellent panelists who are free to introduce themselves afterwards.
Next, Judge Hugh.
Awesome. Hey guys, my name's Hugh. I'm from Wales. Just to maintain Wi-Fi, I'll probably keep my camera off, but best of luck to both teams. I'm sure this is going to be a great debate.
Judge JD.
Hey, my name is JD. I'm from South Korea. Best luck to all the teams.
Judge Tamkeen.
Hi everyone, I'm Tamkeen. I'm from Pakistan. Congratulations on making it so far and best of luck.
And finally, Judge Tamara.
Hi everyone, I'm Tamara. My parents is Yode.
Thank you very much, everyone. Next, we will proceed to do a technical check. Can I invite the speakers on proposition to introduce themselves in their speaking order and their preferred gender pronouns if they have any?
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'll be doing the first in reply. I go by she, her pronouns.
I'm Isaac. I'll be giving the second. He, him is good. And for POIs, they'll be verbally, please. Thank you.
I'm Matthew, speaking third, he, him, and I'll also take POIs verbally. Thanks.
Next, can we have Team Opposition to introduce themselves in the same fashion?
Hi, I'm Eddie. I'll be doing the first speech for the opposition. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and our entire team prefers verbal POIs. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Lynn. I'll be doing the second and reply speeches for side opposition. My preferred pronouns are she, her. All the best to everybody, and thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bowser, and I'll be doing the third opposition speech.
All right, that said, I have 4 reminders. I'll be keeping time for this debate by texting in the Zoom chat at the 1 minute, 7 minute, 8 minute, and 8 minute and 15-second mark. At the end of the speech, I will type the total time spoken for the speech. For reply, that's going to be 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and 4:15. Before you speak, please indicate how you would like to receive your POIs. I think both teams have already done that, so I think that's not needed anymore. With also speakers not speaking in this round, coaches, team managers, and observers, please be reminded to switch off your camera and mute yourself at all times throughout this debate. If you're a designated speaking member or a member of the judging panel in this round, please switch on your camera throughout the debate unless there are any internet connectivity issues, in which case, please message one of the volunteers. This is so that we know you are on the call and can attend to you if there are any dropouts. So with that being said, on the motion, this House objects to the giving of international military aid. I will hand the floor over to the chair judge for this round. Please take it away.
Thank you. I want to congratulate both teams for their excellent achievement in making it to the quarterfinal round of the World Schools Debating Championship. Without any further ado, I invite first proposition to deliver the case for side government. Hear, hear.
Isak. Am I audible and visible? Great. I will take my POIs in the chat, please. Thanks. International military aid is merely throwing fuel into a raging fire.
On proposition, we believe that this aid becomes the battleground of international tensions and worsens the conflicts that it claims to resolve. A few things I'll do in my speech. First, I'll model the debate, then I'll talk about why this aid leads to more war. Secondly, I'll talk about why military aid leads to harmful leverage that prolongs conflict. 3 points of setup. Firstly, that military aid is monetarily assisting the government of a country in its military efforts, either maintaining control or in self-defense. So this might look like giving them money to buy guns and tanks from PMCs like Lockheed Martin in the US. Instances like maintaining control or self-defense are not black and white. Self-defense can look like bloody wars, or cracking down on protesters could look like maintaining control. These are situations that are fair game in this debate. Second point of setup, this debate is not about things like peacekeeping, joint training ventures, or intelligence sharing mechanisms. We are perfectly fine with these things, so we are not leaving these countries alone. We just oppose the unaccountable and inflammatory method of international military aid. And then finally, this debate is not just about the US giving aid. Countries like Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia give a ton of international military aid too. Opposition must contend with the states who don't necessarily have the best incentives. On our side, we prefer a world where no states give international military aid. On my first point then about more war. So there are 2 reasons why the states who give military aid often give it poorly, even if they don't actively have malicious incentives. Firstly, these states often prioritize consolidating their strategic alliances, not necessarily focusing on good or humane military objectives. And this is because the donors of aid are far away from the conflict. They're very insulated from it. So they don't necessarily have a direct interest in whether people who are 1,000 miles away, who are very different from you ethnically and religiously, are dying. Instead, this aid is often prioritized to strategic locations because that is an impact that actively manifests in your country's politics. For example, the US funds Israel because it's the one democratic country in a sea of Middle Eastern countries, or Russia and Belarus are quite close because Belarus is a staunch ally of Putin. This means instead of caring about humanitarian ends, as opposition might claim, this aid is often effectively unconditional because that alliance matters more than the result of the conflict. Secondly, on economic interests. So the Israel lobby in the US, oil interests in Saudi Arabia, Turkish control over the Black Sea and wanting to have access to the Black Sea, often means that you give aid to some countries that are strategically important to you over others. You want to curry their favor and establish control within those areas. So instead of this aid going to states who are actually vulnerable, you prioritize the countries that can help your country the most. Why is this aid going to escalate conflict then? There are 4 reasons for this. Firstly, because there's a lack of accountability. So the recipients of this aid are often quite unstable just by the nature of the motion. Like they are in a conflict, so they need the aid in the first place. This often translates into there being a lack of democratic checks or legitimacy to the government, things like ethnic divisions within the country. This means that the government that uses this aid is both unaccountable, but often uses this aid poorly and has the incentive to use it to entrench its own power. So this looks like Israel using US aid to bomb Palestinian villages, Maduro using Russian aid to roll tanks down the streets and quash protesters. The second reason why this aid will escalate conflict is because you give them more sophisticated weaponry. This is just definitionally true, given that you're receiving money from rich countries and you're now able to buy weapons from their companies. So instead of pistols, you now have machine guns. And even in opposition's best cases with things like terrorism, terrorists are notoriously hard to find, especially with the lack of intelligence gathering mechanisms, which is often the case in these poorer countries. The only addition with international military aid then is that you get more bombs to throw around that kill civilians, that rip families apart, that turn hospitals to rubble, and those are far more sophisticated and destructive. The third reason this point is true is because this funding is two-sided. So there are international rivalries that often manifest in proxy conflicts. China and the US butt heads in the South China Sea by funding opposing countries. The US and Russia fund opposing sides in the war in Syria. This means that it's not just giving money to one side that they can then use this money to just stop the conflict. You are highly unlikely to end the conflict at all because both sides get bankrolled, and so they just clash against each other and that conflict gets worse and worse. The final mechanism here is that you have no incentive to negotiate and actually have an end to the conflict. To come to the table, both sides need to be vulnerable. They need to be unable or unwilling to withstand the economic costs of that conflict anymore. So both sides are like, let's come together and put an end to this. But when you are both being bankrolled by different wealthy countries countries who seemingly have unending reserves of cash, there is no cost to this conflict or not as great of a cost. So you are then just showing weakness when the other side is being paid and you are saying, let's negotiate. This means that countries have no incentive to come to the table and conflicts go on and on. International military aid merely adds fuel to the fire and causes more death and suffering. But for my second point, I'll take the POI.
The premise of your argument is that these countries only care about strategic partnerships when giving aid. If that is true, why are they likely to give humanitarian efforts or share intelligence in a mannerism that helps the most vulnerable on your side of the house?
No. Don't let opposition make this debate into either you fund entirely one thing or entirely the other. We are saying that states' incentives primarily align with strategic objectives. So the states that are strategically important to you will receive more aid and receive it more often, which means the scale of the harm is greater. Of course, there might be isolated instances where there's humanitarian aid, but this debate needs to be one of weighing. Second point then about why military aid leads to harmful leverage. The prior point talks about cases where the aid is given by countries without malicious incentives, which is opposition's best case. This point is about the very real cases where countries want conflict. So these are different situations. The two arguments aren't tense. Opposition must contend with this point as well instead of engaging in a very narrow framework. The characterization here is that the states who have the money to give military aid, while the recipients become dependent on that aid because they need that aid to resolve their conflict, have huge amounts of leverage over the countries that receive that aid. There are two problems that manifest here. Firstly, that these states often have an active incentive to create conflict. This looks like religious incentives, like wanting to expand the influence of your particular sect of Islam, or wanting control over strategically important regions, such as being able to get more control through creating instability, which precludes other countries from getting involved or just knocks other countries out of the area. So this looks like Qatar, who funds the central government of Somalia, while the UAE and Saudi Arabia fund other regions like Somaliland instead, because both actors want control over the Red Sea shipping routes. This means that these actors end up clashing within the country, where Qatar's military aid goes towards bombing other regions of the country for their own power trip and to kick Saudi Arabia out, while entire villages go up in rubble. The second problem here is that aid often creates loyalty, which is harmful. So elites are given power and often enriched by the aid that they receive. Corruption is common in these countries, and there's often little accountability by a state that is embroiled in war. Especially when the other side is bankrolled too, there's no incentive to back down. These actors actively want to keep being involved in the conflict because it benefits them. They're receiving a continuous stream of cash. So this looks like Russia funding the Belarusian government's ability to buy arms in order to get closer access to Crimea in order to resist NATO influence in Eastern Europe. So when Russian troops are now able to move more freely within the Belarusian border, this increases the chance of conflict reoccurring, and it extremely harms pro-democracy efforts around the world. On proposition, we believe that military aid can be abused and is actually counterproductive to its aims. International military aid donors claim to be firefighters, but in reality, they're the arsonists. I'm so proud to propose.
I thank first proposition. I invite first opposition up to deliver the substantive case for side up. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everybody see and hear me? Great. And once again, verbal POIs if possible. Thank you. The nature of aid is that it goes to those with no alternatives we are very proud to oppose. Two arguments in this speech. Firstly, why we protect the most vulnerable actors, and secondly, why we are better than the comparative. But before that, I think there are a couple of things to point out about the proposition case. The first is that they've given us no stance, no comparative about what they want to do in this debate. Would they allow Assad to use chemical warfare with no impunity on their side of the house? What type of accountability do they think that the global police of America have in terms of groups that are being bombed and being threatened by authoritarian regimes? What does their intervention look like? Do you have to tell us that these people are going to pull out entirely, or they're going to rely entirely on UN peacekeeping, or they're to take a harder stance and support sending in troops on the ground? Secondly, they have not reached their burden in this debate, because while they can prove a multiplicity of incentives, while they can prove a multiplicity of characterizations and examples, they need to tell us why the specific mechanism of military aid is in and of itself so harmful. Certain examples don't win them that burden, because this pertains to the sovereignty, this pertains to the mechanisms of a government on a whole to be able to manage their international relations, and they need to tell us as to why they take out this tool in the toolbox and why it is so uniquely different to all the other ways that governments assert their international dominance on the global stage. Given that, I think there's a very clear thing to say about the characterization of the comparative in this debate. That is to say, proposition cannot make out arms deals so that guns and bombs can still be bought on their side of the house. What that means then is that when they talk about actors such as authoritarian governments, when they talk about actors like terrorism, it is very likely that these individuals and groups will still be buying arms on both sides of the house. Why is this the case? Because authoritarians are rich. They often have a huge amount of resources, which is why they're able to put down their oppression towards their people, because they have, for example, money that they spend on the military. Or authoritarians have a control over industrialization, which means that they can start producing guns and arms instead and start buying guns instead of having them as aid. And terrorism, for example, can have money through the black market, like the way that the Taliban sells heroin, or they can employ child soldiers and other ways of grassroots levying arms on their side of the house. So they have to tell us necessarily how these dangerous actors are stopped from getting dangerous weapons when individual aid pulls out. That being said, the comparative in this debate is about vulnerable actors who don't have the money, don't have the capital, don't have the resources and infrastructure to have military assistance when that aid pulls out. Firstly then, why do we protect vulnerable actors? What do these actors look like? Firstly, it looks like in post-conflict societies that are ravaged by insurgents. It looks like South Sudan, who deals with Janjaweed, who are killing innocent civilians. It looks like Serbian extremists in Kosovo who want to kill the Albanian ethnicity group there. Secondly, it looks like oppressed minorities and stateless groups, like Kurdish individuals inside of Turkey, who for every day have to struggle for their right to sovereignty. The Chechnyan freedom fighters who have to stand up to the entire military of Putin. Thirdly, it is those countries that are surrounded by hostile actors are in incredibly vulnerable positions. South Korea after the Korean War, Israel in the 70s, when America came in and supported them with the Iron Dome and THAAD, that necessarily means they had the creation of that state. So they have to tell us necessarily then uniquely how they help these actors. What do we think the incentives are to help those actors on our side of the house? And note, if they want to mech for things such as humanitarian aid and peacekeeping, then those incentives are symmetric, that there is a strategic resource. But listen, why do strategic incentives and altruistic humanitarian incentives usually align? Firstly, because of the factor of stability, that many times what it means to be strategically embroiled inside of a nation means that you want things such as economic stability, means you want things such as political stability within those nations, means you want reliable trading partners who for some reason have a running economy. To that extent then, you have an incentive to make sure that terrorist groups and insurgents don't run amok, because that hurts your bottom line. Secondly, when you want to secure actors, when you want to secure allies, you have an incentive to make sure that those allies are not rogue nations. You have an incentive to make sure that they are not looked down on the international stage, that they have a say in the UN because they don't oppress freedoms of human rights. So if you want to build strategic allies, then it probably means you have an incentive to democratize, liberalize, or make these actors more reliable, because that means you have a better ally in the global stage. But thirdly, it is about global perception. That hegemons in the status quo are fighting for a perception of trust. When you look at comparatives between American aid and the BRI, China and America are trying to bolster their PR in terms of helping these nations and helping these stateless groups, to the extent that they have an incentive to make sure that they want to secure long-term allies. It has to be done in a good way. So everything they tell us about strategic reasoning is correct. Those strategic reasonings often align with altruistic incentives. Why is the comparative insufficient then? And why is aid uniquely the only mechanism to help these vulnerable groups? The first thing to note here is that the political capital in the status quo means that if you cannot send them aid, you usually send them nothing at all, because these issues are too macro for voters to care about. When you worry about the dynamics in regional areas and the conflicts that are happening in places far away from the world, it is very unlikely that a politician can palatability say that we're going to send troops on the ground, we're going to endanger the lives of young Americans, young American men and women, and send them over there. It is a much more unreliable way to support these individual countries, because there's an irrational reaction at the point in which you become much, much more involved, which is the comparative on their side of the house. That means they probably do have to support a world in which these people aren't helped at all, or in the case in which it's like UN peacekeeping, it's helped to an incredibly ineffectual extent. But even if they have other alternatives, why are they not as good as aid? Firstly, because aid has the flexibility of cash, that solutions are incredibly different for different countries, and that cash is the best way to empower those nations to make that country. They can invest in different things like artillery shells if it's for defensive, or for AK-47s if they have to do more guerrilla fighting. These are things that are different when you look at the individual context. But secondly, aid uniquely upholds the sovereignty of the places that these countries are going to. The fact is that these countries understand the specific plans and context better than American soldiers. It means that they themselves can have their own say and control over where that money goes to and over where those arms are controlled. But thirdly, it's about long-termism, that upon their side of the house, they support things such as a military intervention through sending in troops. Then eventually, at some point, you have to pull out, and when you pull out, you leave a vacuum. When aid doesn't do that, because instead it builds up a slow amount of infrastructure that can continuously be used. So right now, if America were to pull out all aid from Israel, still be allowed to survive even in the most hostile settings because of the fact that they'd already built up that infrastructure when they're in an incredibly fragile state. What is the impact of this? That you need these military arms in order for these countries to survive. Because while they talk about things such as building infrastructures, buildings and hospitals don't do anything when ISIS is running around killing civilians. When you need that military aid then in order to establish the humanitarian aid that they want, to protect the peacekeepers, to protect the contractors, to protect infrastructure development, only we get that. When we bolster the defense of young nations and vulnerable groups, it means the Kurds can stand off for one more day against ISIS and Erdogan. They can hold their village against these foreign actors. It means that the territory captured by Boko Haram that kidnaps and tortures young women can get pushed back, and those people can finally be liberalized. It means that people in Korea in the 70s can sleep safe at night, knowing that they do not have to worry about an imminent invasion coming from North Korea. All of these things only happen when you empower those governments to have the arms to protect their sovereignty. Before I go on, I'd be happy to take a POI.
So I don't think you listened to our model. We had joint training ventures and intelligence sharing mechanisms to find the terrorists that are far more sophisticated than throwing cash at the problem. Why do you need machine guns and bombs that end up mowing down the civilians you want to save?
Okay, firstly, like that's the metric, right? If you can have intelligence sharing, we have that too. But secondly, what good is it knowing where a terrorist is if you can't shoot them? Secondly, why are we better than the comparative? Listen, the framing here on global impacts and proxy wars means that we're taking them at their best. They make proxy wars worse for three reasons. Firstly, it is more escalatory because instead, when these governments still have an incentive to, for example, meddle into politics of the Middle East because it's incredibly important for their oil trade, then they'll have to do something about it. Like American Jews will still push for the lobby to do something about the issue of the Palestinian Intifada. To that extent, then, it is much more likely that you send in individual troops, which even further worsens all of their problems of proxy wars, because now if you kill an American soldier, that in and of itself is a declaration of World War III. But secondly, they have less accountability, because if these nations instead turn to other forms of military assistance in terms of funding their own militaries, it means that there's no way that America can ever reel them back in the point in which human rights abuses get too bad. That is why, for example, Saudi Arabia has been curbing their human rights atrocities inside of the Yemeni war because of the fact that there is international backlash from America. But thirdly, you have less control at the point in which you pull out at any point means that these countries turn into a vacuum. We would say that it's better to have necessary intervention at some point when that inaction leads to the death of millions of people. They need to provide us how they help vulnerable actors and why proxy wars don't get worse on their side of the house. Very proud to oppose.
I think first opposition, I invite second proposition to continue the case for side government. Here.
Sorry, let me just take a second to organize the papers here. The examples opposition used in this round are frankly horrible for their side. They talk about Israel needing to defend themselves, yet let's look to the status quo where Israel is defending themselves with this aid, and it is resulting in huge amounts of human rights abuses. They talk about Syria. They say, would you support their use of chemical weapons? No, and the reason we wouldn't have that on our side is because they wouldn't be funded by Russia to get those chemical weapons in the first place. They talk about North Korea and South Korea. Yes, these are huge amounts of problems where both sides were funded by the United States and Russia, and that led to a huge amount of conflict. The important thing then on our side was that we identified that there is a collective action problem where these sides are both being fueled up in the conflict and they are being powered up, and that is resulting in huge amounts of devastation into the long term. So they can throw these examples around all they want, but the reality of them is that it is the case that they result in huge scales of human rights abuses that our side could avoid. International military aid donors claim to be the firefighters, but they are in fact the arsonists. I want to talk about three things in this speech. First, I want to clear up the burden push that we get from opposition. Then I want to talk about defense and war and deal with their first argument on vulnerable actors. And then second, I want to talk about how states exercise their leverage and deal with their non-argument on the comparative. First of all, then, on the burden push, they simply suggest that we have no stance or comparative. But the question is, how does this example set on Assad actually work for them? We would suggest that it is far more likely that evil authoritarian actors like the Syrian regime can get access to these weapons in the first place when it is the case that they are being funded by large military actors like Russia. But second, notice that this isn't how debating works. Obviously, it's the case that we cannot prove for a fact in the context of a debate that X will happen, but we have given you overwhelming reasons to suggest that this is the case that by and large, there's a substantial moral hazard to allowing this to exist in the first place. We wouldn't support, therefore, having military aid, and that's why it's something that is devastating. And I want to note that at the end of their refutation, they do seem to run into a bit of a tension. They suggest that authoritarian actors are extremely rich, profiting off of the corrupt systems that exist. But then it's the case that they suggest that by and large, actors have no alternatives. This is a massive tension for them and suggests that it undercuts their entire argument on vulnerable actors. With that covered up, let's talk about defense and war and deal with their argument on vulnerable actors. I want to note then that a few things. First, we would suggest that funding crowds out humanitarian aid. And this is an incredibly important link that we suggest. That is to say that humanitarian aid is likely to be given only when it's the case that there is sufficient stability for individuals to enter in the first place. But crucially, funding leads to conflict for all the reasons that we provided you, that funding leads to increased tension and funding fuels conflict between sides. But furthermore, it means that states are unlikely to make the calculation in the first place, that obviously there is a substantial cost to the AU deciding whether or not they would like to send in peacekeeping troops. But if it is easier and more possible to send in hundreds of millions of dollars, then that is the more likely thing for them to do. The question is, which solutions do they make more available to these actors? We would suggest that they allow them to brush off humanitarian aid, where that is something that would be useful, by saying, here, use this alternative of funding instead. But second, I do want to note that the entirety of this example is incredibly Western-centric. North Korea is a hostile actor who is funded by the USSR, and that suggests that this very nature of military aid is what is leading to these conflicts in the first place. So crucially then, there are cases where there isn't that symmetric incentive to be humanitarian. So it is the case that Russia has a unique incentive then to do things like fund Maduro to allow him to quash protesters, or do the same thing in Belarus. So what that means is that this example doesn't apply in the vast majority of circumstances where there's huge amounts of funding that occurs through pernicious actors. But thirdly, we agree that intervention is unlikely to happen in most cases. But peacekeeping is what we think is likely to occur in lots of cases. And the reason is, we think that these types of conflicts are likely to secure widespread buy-in. And the reason is because there is spillover. In the context of Africa, for example, there is spillover between Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and that suggests that there is huge amounts of incentive on the part of peacekeeping actors to engage, because society writ large is being affected by these conflicts. This is true of the UN as well, where the notion that a multiplicity of states within that union are being affected leads to international pressure to engage in the first place. So that suggests that humanitarian aid is uniquely likely on our side. But fourthly, I want to deal with their final impact on vacuums. We would suggest that this is much worse on their side, because on their side, if conflicts are resolved, weapons are around. People have access to weapons, they have access to money, and that is used to fuel things like terrorism, which is why we've seen the emergence of terrorism in the aftermath of huge amounts of engagement on the part of the United States. But I do want to bring back some of the analysis that we suggest, that there is a collective action problem, because the problem is that states are funding both sides of the conflict. Therefore, the need for defense is raised by this policy, so our states might otherwise be more protected and more capable of dealing with these problems. They become less able to do so because we fund the conflict on both sides. So that means where the United States and Russia are funding two opposing sides of a conflict, that you increase the risk to either country, and that increases the need for defense. If you eliminate that in the first place, these countries are much safer and much better off. Our argument then is on more war. And this is important to note that oftentimes, even where this aid has like conditions attached, that it often is functionally unconditional. And the reason is because there is a reactionary funding mechanism and a huge strategic interest to provide these countries with huge amounts of aid. And I also want to note that this argument applies to furthering terrorism, because even at OPS best, where conflict is resolved, countries and groups with various interests are flush with weapons. This allows conflict to spread and continue when terrorist organizations can now fill power vacuums and seize on the instability with huge amounts of force that have been provided to them by foreign actors. So that suggests that vulnerable actors have two things. One, they are made worse off because of the long-term effects of having these weapons existing in the country in the first place, where you have machine gun now where terrorist organizations otherwise wouldn't have access to them. But second, that these vulnerable actors are made worse off because you are funding both sides of the conflict, and that means that the need for defense is raised and the amount of risk and human life that is taken is much, much greater. On to the second area of this speech on how states exercise leverage and on our argument, or on the arguments on comparative. I'll take a POI quickly.
In the status quo, what is your comparative for assisting the Kurds and stopping them from being genocided by the Turkish government?
So we think there are things like in the status quo that currently exist, like joint training missions, which are already accommodating for that. Okay, on to how states exercise leverage. So their argument is broadly that you will go in and you will engage, and that will be negative, although this is slightly tense, but I assume there's like they're operating in different circumstances, like taking it as our best or something. We think that foreign intervention is unlikely to happen in most cases because there are substantial incentives not to do this. First, because the substantial human and economic cost of war. This is particularly true of all actors in the debate, particularly a side like Russia, which doesn't have the domestic capital to be able to engage in wide-scale war. But second, because the cultural trauma associated with interventions like that of Afghanistan and the huge amount of failures that have resulted from them. So these are unlikely, but where these conflicts do happen and intervention does occur, we think it is better. First, because often funding through aid precludes positive intervention like AU peacekeeping forces, and this is especially true when funding increases. But second, because greater accountability checks exist through media attention and public scrutiny when war is a massive cost to your image as a leader. But lastly, on their notion of backlash, we think that it is far more true of money because accountability checks are far removed. First, because it often occurs through private contractors that are separated from the state. But second, that governments are far from the actions. It isn't actually their troops committing the human rights atrocities. And so in that sense, they are far more immune from all the damage and all the backlash that stems from that. So that suggests that that comparative won't arise. But our argument on leverage is much more important, that there's a significant desire to create tension in these regions. But more than that, even if the money is going to these vulnerable actors, it isn't being spent correctly. Instead, it is going into the hands of elites and it isn't being used to benefit vulnerable people. For that reason, then, proud to propose.
I think second proposition. I invite second opposition to continue the substantive case recite out. Hear.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this? Okay, great. If Assad wanted chemical weapons to use on his people, he can force scientists to develop it for him, just like the way that Nazi Germany did back then. It doesn't matter if Russia or USA approves of this choice, it will happen because he's an authoritarian regime who wants this to happen. The difference is on their house, they need to tell you why joint training programs or getting intel is enough to fight terrorists when it requires guns, when it requires money, when it requires you to have the resources that keep on going in this fight, and it requires the USA to tell you you have to dedicate a certain amount of resources in fighting terrorists, and they do not get that on their side of the House. There are a few clarifications at the top of my speech. One, something is currently funded by aid is not analysis. It just means that it's currently this way. It doesn't mean that once you remove this like aid that currently exists, they won't find another way to get the same impacts and the same outcome, because that's not something they prove, that even without aid, the same thing will happen. So all their negative examples regarding authoritarian regimes or abuses of human rights abuses can equally happen on their side for a few reasons. Syria can force scientists to develop these nuclear weapons. North Korea literally starves people to increase their military budget and nuclearize the country so they can increase their military spending and fight wars no matter how much they want, because they don't care about starving the people. Saudi Arabia, they have so much oil money and corruption, as they characterize, to just buy arms, whether through other countries or through the black market. So all these harms of wars started, or proxy conflict, or increased exacerbation of wars, if these governments want to fight the wars, it will happen symmetrically. They haven't proven a positive impact. But two, let's address the new asserted counter model of humanitarian aid. Why is it not enough? One, their speaker says you need stability to go in with humanitarian aid. What secures security? The fact that you have a military to protect the sovereignty, that no one questions the government's establishment of these borders, and there's no border skirmishes that come in because they see there's a chance of weakness because their military is not established. So if there needs to be stability to come in, it only shows you that humanitarian aid is contingent on some degree of military aid to be prop up your military to a basic degree. Two, they need to prove to you that there's political capital for humanitarian aid, because it seems to me that's just given to people on the ground. That's not something that people rally around, versus when it's about like military and about engaging in these conflicts, there's a sense of urgency and you motivate the people. Lastly, they need to tell you why humanitarian aid also fights terrorists, also secure border control for the Kurds and things like that, and establish a nation like South Sudan, which they cannot do and replace on their side of the house. So they still don't address all of our problems. Thirdly, wars are not caused by military aid. Military aid is a reaction to wars that are already started. So when Russia goes into annex Crimea for no reason, that's when the US says, shoot, we have to come in with military aid, and they came in with billions and billions of dollars. It is when Assad already rolled over its people that we said we have to fund the Kurds and fund other counter forces because things already occur. So their like mechanism of like bad impacts is just wars. That's already happening. What military aid does is it pinpoints a power disparity, and it fills up the power disparity so no one gets steamrolled just because they're not an authoritarian government. With that being said, two questions and two impacts in this debate. Firstly, vulnerable actors, and second of all, about proxy wars and global conflicts. Firstly, on vulnerable actors, here's where they only do incentive analysis, and that's not good enough, because they tell you that when there's a bipolar world order with two hegemons, they will fund both sides. That's a problem, because if their problem is with people checking each other, even if not through the form of humanitarian aid, they're going to do so in other ways. So if I send peacekeepers in, you will send more. I send tanks in, you will send more. It still escalates conflicts in the same way that they want to describe. They need to tell you what the difference is. So if they only analyze incentives, that's not good enough to prove their case. But two, I would argue to you that it is a good thing that this checking mechanism exists, because there are natural incentives to trade with strongmen like Saudi Arabia and MBS or Assad, because they rule a country and you want to get on their good side. But versus small groups like Kurds, when it's just about a humanitarian stance to stand for their country, they're likely going to be very weak later on, and there's no practical benefit of us helping them. There's lack of incentive to fund them. So in their house, they'll just trade with Assad or trade with Saudi Arabia because it makes them a lot of money and gains them an ally, but no one is there to like help the Kurds. This only exists when you think there's a necessity to check the other side, and you can easily do it by giving them some money, and people wouldn't fight back against you because you're not sending in troops and troops of people and sacrificing your own people. So if anything, we help the most vulnerable of individuals like stateless minorities. Second of all, let's talk about the actor of terrorists, because what they said is that we will give them better weapons on our side of the house. Firstly, again, they need proof to why this is exclusive when they can go to the black market and get things. But two, even if they are given better weapons, like we also get more information when we can set up alert systems, when we can have better weapons to target them, so we don't lower the collateral damage of when a like grassroots government is trying to target them. You have a lot of collateral damage because you have to go through the civilians, versus when you have proper arms, proper alert systems, proper GPS tracking devices, you target the terrorists without all that collateral damage that exists on their side of the house. But thirdly, regarding the inflaming of these terrorist sentiment, it's worse on their side, because when American troops are sent in on these peacekeeping missions, then American soldiers are bombing your houses, you'll demonize the West and buy into the terrorist narrative. Versus if we're giving money to your local government to fight ISIS, you don't inflame that anti-West rhetoric that recruits the very blood of individuals. So if anything, they recruit more people into terrorist organizations as well. Lastly, I want to talk about new governments, a stakeholder you do not care to address at all. There's a principle of sovereignty at stake, that you're basically expecting an infant nation to enter into a world of interconnectivity and globalization and be able to defend themselves even though they had nothing to begin with. If you respect people's self-determination, then when they don't have enough money, you have to give them unconditional aid. They can't trade trade. They can't rely on anything else. You have to give them this money for them to build up their borders so they can maintain sovereignty and self-determination for the people. When they don't even address the new government and as a stakeholder, they hurt the very people who are weak but still want their own borders, their own government, their own representation. Second question, I want to talk about proxy wars and global conflict. One, all they give to you is that incentives of global hegemons are bad because they will only focus on strategic regions. First, same thing for peacekeeping and troop training. You will only go into strategic regions because you can't send an infinite amount of commanders to go in there and train individuals. But two, if they say that incentives of the global actors are bad, these effects will actualize in a worse way on their side of the house when there are actual troops being sent in, actual commanders sent in, and actual tanks sent in. And this is why, because ultimately the tanks and troops answer to Russian command, answer to China command, versus when money is transaction, I can't just wire it back to my own bank account with my own will. You get absolutely control over what you want to use it for. So in the example of Kosovo, for example, their goal is to establish their own country and protect Albanians from ethnic persecution. That's what the government is going to use it for because that was their goal with the money. Versus if Russia gets to control the troops that are trying to achieve this mission, they'll focus on their own strategic regions as they want to talk about and focus on protecting only the resource-rich areas, the oil-rich areas, instead of protecting the Albanians because we're not a government trying to establish Kosovo. We're just trying to take care of our strategic regions. So that control on their side house is a very bad thing that undercuts all of their positive impacts. Second of all, I want to talk about de-escalation. But before that, I'll take a POI.
So as per your own analysis and first about donors wanting accountability, military aid goes to governments and not random groups. So if Assad can just magic chemical weapons out of nowhere, why can't he find the money to fight terrorism? Either you watch the whole debate or you concede that this aid creates more conflict.
No, Assad is not going to fight terrorists. ISIS is a very pervasive force. He's going to focusing on cracking down on the people so he gets the government. He's not going to focusing on fighting ISIS. Versus, for example, when you give aid to Bahrain, when you give aid to other countries like Somalia, you can say a part of this needs to be used to fund ISIS. Versus if they go through other channels like cracking down on people to get the money, there's no accountability to say we have to help our brethren fight ISIS. There's another additional point in which this leverage is actually good when you're tied to the US and you fight ISIS. Second of all, on de-escalation, one, we think money allows you to de-escalate because you can still negotiate and go to conferences after Lend-Lease Act in World War II and talk about how there are other ways out of this besides just direct conflict. Versus if they send one commander in, one training soldier in, and if they get killed, negotiations cannot happen because your local people will never accept that you gave a peace deal even though they killed one of our own men. So they're pushed into more conflicts, whereas we can get the ability to negotiate. But two, war ending in and of itself is not a good impact. And that's the assertion from side proposition that the second world end is not prolonged. That's an automatic good. But that also just means Assad steamrolled over its people and therefore war ended really quickly. Or Nazi Germany suddenly won World War II because no one stand in resistance. What we're doing is we're bridging that gap. The people with power, with money, they're going to launch wars on either side of the house because they see a window of opportunity. Aid doesn't come in those circumstances because aid are these few countries are ready to fight wars and they've accumulated that wealth. Aid comes to counteract that. When you allow Britain and the US to mobilize and stand against Nazi Germany in order to give us a fighting chance. Vulnerable actors are ones counting on aid, whereas authoritarian regimes will strong arm their way out of situations we're so proud to oppose.
I thank second opposition for that speech. I invite third proposition to continue the case for government bench. I'd remind all speakers to keep the time.
I'll take POIs verbally, please, if that's all right. Assad cannot force the development of chemical weapons when he is not bankrolled by Russia and doesn't have the funds or scientific know-how to do so. The government in Mogadishu is too poor to gun down semi-autonomous secessionist states in Somalia unless Qatar is backing them and giving them bombs. This is the fundamental claim from our side that still has gone unengaged with by the opposition. If you are confused at this point about what opposition is trying to argue, you are not alone. On the one hand, they say these states are so poor they have no alternatives to defend themselves. On the other hand, these are rich autocrats who are so rich they're going to get arms deals anyway. In the latter case, I'm completely unclear as to what the margins in this debate actually are. I think Prop was initially right when they said the relevant part of this debate is in cases where the international aid is the unique thing propelling conflict. Second, in minute one, we're told military intervention won't happen in the alternative, and therefore these states are going to be left alone. But then the real problem is the US is going to go invade Israel and wage a proxy conflict between Israel and Gaza there. Remarkably implausible. If they say that authoritarian regimes aren't going to go to conflict because there's going to be international backlash, why is it true that they're going to use child soldiers on their side of the house as per the impact of first opposition? By the end of this debate, I'm completely confused about what opposition actually thinks the incentives of these actors really are. I'm going to look at three themes in this debate. and show why these are each independent ways of breaking the deadlock as to why you get worse war rather than better war on their side, and conclusively show that while international military aid donors claim to be the firefighters, in reality, they are the arsonists. The first theme I want to talk about is the incentives of donors. Now, I finally understand the opposition strategy, which is to wash out every single example except the Kurds. It's worth noting that military aid to vulnerable groups like the Kurds is by far the most minimal example in this debate. And that's structurally because states usually do not have incentives to fund rebel groups for fear of alienating other more powerful state actors like Turkey, who would be very, very mad if you do so. This is why the overwhelming characterization in this debate and the overwhelming amount of military aid that is actually given is given to countries like Syria by Russia, to Belarus or Israel or Saudi Arabia. So let me engage now with the arguments they give us to why states have good incentives. Firstly, they say states have an incentive to create political and economic stability and reliable trade partners. There are a couple things to point out. Number one, geographical distance means you do not bear the cost of instability. The US does not bear the cost of buildings being bombed in Gaza. Congressmen in the US simply say it was just self-defense. Second, the state being backed may want economic stability in a vacuum, but you have to consider two additional features. Number one, oftentimes it is possible to use instability to actually rile up your base politically. Take the example of Israel. It's people who are closest to the Iron Dome in Israel, closest to rocket attacks coming in from Gaza, who are most likely to support Netanyahu, because the instability and fear of their lives actually emboldens strongmen leaders like Netanyahu. So it's not even clear if those strongmen themselves that an opposition is necessarily backing have an incentive to de-escalate for those reasons. The next thing they tell you is you don't want allies that are rogue countries. Like, I mean, I just question this on face, given that the US effectively partners with Saudi Arabia. And my prior response on accountability, I think, deals with this argument. All right. Then what we told you is that the actual incentives of states giving aid are this, that it's a way of consolidating strategic alliances, not a way of accomplishing inherently good objectives with respect to minimizing human casualties. One, because you don't face the consequences of war very far away. Second, because you often have strategic incentives to consolidate influence. For example, Gulf states in the Horn of Africa, where Qatar, for instance, has an incentive to kick out Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because whoever controls Horn of Africa controls the Red Sea and therefore can shut off shipping routes to the rest of the world for their enemy in the Gulf. So there are often vital strategic interests, even if it causes instability, to necessarily consolidate your influence and back other states. Thirdly, because we told you there are often political and economic incentives like the Israel lobby in the United States or oil in Saudi Arabia. No analysis with this whatsoever. All these reasons suggest that on balance, you're going to be funding worse actors rather than the good ones. The next claim they give is you need money for vulnerable actors. I already outframed their example on the Kurds, but a couple of additional responses I want to give. Number one, this doesn't engage with our collective action problem analysis, which is that one country might back a region whose aims are desirable, but if that country's enemy funds the opposing side in a quasi-proxy conflict, on net, this simply leads to more conflict. We gave you the example of Saudi Arabia and the UAE backing semi-autonomous regions in Somalia and Qatar backing the central government of Somalia in opposition. So even if in theory you can back good groups, the only reason you need to back good groups is because your opponents are funding and backing groups that are oppositional to them. This is why we'd be better off with no aid whatsoever in a world where you wouldn't have these military conflicts at all. Secondly, because in cases where there are existential conflicts to the region and threats abroad, like jihadists or piracy, there are active incentives for other forms of assistance. For example, like AU peacekeeping or coalitions to crack down on terrorist efforts. Note, in these cases, there is a sufficient mass of other countries interested in preventing these harms. And that is why you actually end up getting the positive forms of interventions we talked about. But finally, we told you that oftentimes preferable alternatives like peacekeeping are actively crowded out by the amount of conflict that exists within these countries. An argument that was given in second and that went unengaged with. That when you back countries through actual military aid, you are less likely to get the types of humanitarian interventions that we talked about, which oftentimes happen effectively due to the amount of multilateral efforts and accountability that you have in these cases. They could try to wash out the entirety of the debate. They didn't engage with our actual analysis as to why these states have poor incentives. Second theme, irrespective of what the donors' incentives are, here is why conflict gets worse. Before I go on, I'll take the POI.
How do you resolve the underlying causes of wars that happen before military aid comes into the picture?
That happened before military aid. Well, we gave the analysis in second, which I'll get into now, about why there's an active incentive to de-escalate on our side of the house, which is eliminated on your side when you get bankrolled. But I'm going to get into that in a moment. So on their argument, which is now proxy conflicts are going to get worse. We told you this is massively unlikely, given that there are strong incentives not to go to war in the majority of cases. It means you're losing your troops. It means you're losing your soldiers. It means you're enduring massive economic costs. But in the relatively few cases where there is broad international support for humanitarian interventions, we think those cases can be desirable. And crucially, this is the link. States have realized that self-interested wars are never in their own interest, given the massive cost of their own soldiers, given the political costs where it's more desirable to spend money at home. This is why the wars that are fought are actually the good ones. They end up looking like PSC peacekeeping missions in Africa. Because what we told you is that for the most part, states don't have the vicious proxy war incentives to go into war and fight terrible conflicts because they realize in the long run that will come back to bite them and it won't be politically palatable in any way. This is why in most cases it's unlikely to be the alternative, but in cases where it is the alternative, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Finally, our analysis on why conflict gets worse. They never actually engage with our analysis, which is that if both sides are being bankrolled, you have no incentive to mediate. Their response was money allows for de-escalation, but this was literally just a counter assertion in second opposition. I have no idea what the analysis actually was there. Our argument was very simple. Two sides only have an incentive to mediate, to negotiate, and to de-escalate when they can no longer endure the economic and military consequences of staying in and prolonging that conflict. They are able to do so when both sides are being backed by international aid that they are capable of receiving solely on the basis that it is aid and that it is not arms deals. And that is why on their side, you completely undermine any prospect for negotiation and de-escalation. Third theme then on leverage. And I don't leave much time for this because we still have not gotten a response after 16 minutes of opposition. What we told you that sometimes aid is unconditional, but sometimes where there's huge asymmetric leverage that a country holds over other countries, there is the ability to implement conditions on the way that is used. But crucially, that allows rich states who don't necessarily have the best incentives to use this leverage for malicious reasons. One, we told you about how often states give aid as an incentive to create conflict, to consolidate control over strategically important regions. We gave you the example of Qatar and the Horn of Africa. Second, we told you in the first speech about how this creates a sense of loyalty, how you feel as though you owe Saudi Arabia favors as an elite who's being enriched by the aid that they are giving you. And as a consequence, you are willing to spark military conflict in your region. Now, crucially, authoritarian regimes abroad that are funding you, like Saudi Arabia, do not care because they do not face the actual consequences of instability because it's far away and geographically isolated. But the people on the ground do care when they face the massive cost of economic instability, when they face the massive increase in human casualties that occur, when faraway actors are sparking conflict at their expense. We're very happy to propose.
I thank third prop. I invite third op to close out the substantive case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible, visible, and may I begin? Oh, we're good, right? Okay. Ooh, my shoe. Okay, I'll get started. At the offset, I want to deal with the contradiction that proposition accuses us of making. They say that, quote, on one hand, states are poor, but on the other hand, you say that these states are too rich to need military aid. They misunderstand the nuance of our case, that some states are too poor. So this is the Kurds, this is the individuals in South Sudan, but other states are rich. So these are in states like Saudi Arabia, states like Israel. So there wasn't a contradiction here. We're talking about two different types of conflicts. But the second thing to understand is that they're also accused of a second contradiction when they say that on one hand, you say that these states will pull out. And on the other hand, you say that these states will send boots on the ground. Once again, we're talking about two different conflicts. When you talk about Israel, America is likely to send troops in because the Jewish lobby is very, very powerful. Whereas in contrast, America is likely to pull out of the Kurds and Sudan because of the fact that there isn't really lots of political capital there to send your troops into the conflict. With that in mind, I'm going to structure my whip speech around the two types of conflicts we have talked about in this debate. First, on proxy wars, and second, on the protection of the most vulnerable actors. First, let us discuss the point about proxy wars. Understand the characterization of proxy wars, which is usually regime to regime conflict. So this is Saudi Arabia versus Iran. This is Ethiopia versus Eritrea. The proposition claim we get under here is that you create an escalation of warfare to the point wherein the US and Russia found opposing sides. The first thing to understand is that those proxy wars will still exist on both sides of the house, right? Because Saudi Arabia wants to be the Sunni protectorate, Iran wants to be the Shia protectorate. Those religious fault lines still exist, those wars will still exist. But second, we mitigate this argument to a huge extent when we told you that states like Saudi Arabia and Israel do not need American military aid. They are rich enough to buy the weapons themselves. Saudi Arabia can just buy from Lockheed Martin directly instead of using American military aid. Then proposition comes back and says, well, the difference is that they have more arms, the point where America is giving military aid. But the deadlock breaker in this clash isn't the amount of guns Saudi Arabia has, but rather it is the way we use them. And we proved to you from the offset that Saudi Arabia would use them better, the point in which America was involved in a conflict. The first thing we told you was accountability. That yes, first proposition is right when they say that Saudi Arabia is not a democratic state, but that rogue Saudi Arabia is still going to exist on their side of the house. In contrast, we have a leveraged bargaining chip on our side, the point when the United States is giving aid to Saudi Arabia. That is the point at which we can use the threat of pulling out that aid as a threat to get Saudi Arabia to come to the negotiation table. Is this threat perfect or is this threat huge? It's not, but it's a leverage and bargaining chip that simply does not exist on their side of the house. This is why you got the Abraham Accord signed, right? The reason why you got the Abraham Accord signed between Israel and Saudi Arabia was because the United States had some leveraging power there because they funded Saudi Arabia. But second, I think like Western weapons are good, right? Like the India-China debate 3 years ago. Like I think that those Western weapons mean that they're more accurate and it means that you're able to kill the target that you want to kill. In contrast, if Saudi Arabia doesn't have Western military assistance, that's a point at which they make chemical weapons. That's a point at which they make barrel bombs. That is when they use child soldiers and suicide bombers, right? Because those mechanisms and those weapons are cheaper, but those weapons also cause a lot more collateral damage, the point when they're unable to be regulated. Whereas in contrast, if you're giving them money to buy advanced US weaponry, at least you can target the right people. But third, let us talk about negotiation and peace talks, which is why we win this debate the clearest. The first thing they say is that you don't want to seem weak and therefore you don't want to come to the negotiation table. Yeah, like weakness is a symmetrical harm, right? Like on either side, you don't want to seem weak. That's a symmetrical reason as to why you won't negotiate. But then they say that the point wherein both sides are bankrolled is also the point wherein there isn't an incentive in negotiation. No, we think precisely the opposite is true. Because if state one in the conflict is being bankrolled by Russia and state two in the conflict is being bankrolled by the United States, then neither one of those two actors sees an end to the war, the point wherein they think that their enemy is very, very powerful because they're being bankrolled by the other superpower. The point we're in, that you create wars in which the US funds one side and Russia funds another side, that's a deterrence as to why they'll come to a negotiation table. That's a deterrence as to that's a deterrence as to why they'll be more likely to have peace talks. That is why there were peace talks in Vietnam panel, because like American troops realized they couldn't push on anymore because the Viet Cong was too wealthy and funded by Russia and China. So if anything, they only want to come to the negotiation table when they think that the other side is equally as powerful as them, and therefore there isn't an imminent end to the conflict. Thus, that is when they can no longer see any positive gain of the conflict and why they're more likely to come to the negotiation table. In contrast, that incentive doesn't exist on their side of the house because the point we're in, your opposition isn't being funded by a superpower. That's a point where you might think that, hey, I might be able to take them out. But furthermore, like the losses of the war are just bigger on our side when you're being funded by Russia and the United States. There's an incentive as to why you'll go to the negotiation table to prevent that from happening. In conclusion, we think proxy wars isn't going to win this debate because Saudi Arabia is still rich on both sides of the house. The bigger delta in this debate is when we talk to you about the protection of the vulnerable groups. Understand that there will always be an asymmetry between the powerful authoritarian despots versus the vulnerable minorities. This is because of numerical strength, so there are more Muslims than there are Kurds. This is also because Assad controls vital resources that the Kurds don't, and this is also because there are historical fault lines. Therefore, Assad will go after the Kurds with or without Russia. Saudi Arabia will engage in Sunni conflicts throughout the Middle East with or without the support of the United States or other actors. The difference then isn't whether or not those wars exist in the first place, but rather how you protect the vulnerable minorities. Because here's the thing, the marginal increase of Assad's capacity when Russia funds them is a lot smaller proportionally than the increase of the Kurdish capacity to defend themselves when America funds them. Because the difference between making a powerful actor on their side of the house more powerful and making a powerless actor in the status quo have some power on our side of the house. So the Kurds on their side are going to be destroyed because those Kurds don't have the resources and the money to buy military supplies. Their response is, one, you guys have joint training exercises. But what's the point of teaching them how to shoot a gun if they don't have the money to buy a gun, right? And furthermore, if they want to talk about humanitarian aid can only occur when these regimes trust you and you build that trust through giving them military aid. And you can only have humanitarian aid when you know for a fact that your peacekeepers won't be attacked. You can only get that security when you give them military aid so that they're able to have a powerful, regime there, right? Therefore, the comparison isn't a world of peace, but rather a world of genocide on their side of the house. Peace on proposition is a masquerade for the suppression that the Kurds will go through on their side of the house. There's a world in which Israel would be dead after the 6-day war and wouldn't be a state today. This is how you should weigh this clash.
Their highest impact is that conflicts will be prolonged, the point wherein the US and Russia bankroll opposition sides. Here's the thing. The majority of people who die in those conflicts are combatants, right? They're the people who are using guns. In contrast, the people who would die on their side of the house, the point wherein Kurdistan stops getting funding, and as a result, Assad goes in. The people then that would die on their side of the house are not combatants, but rather children, mothers, and the entirety of their culture. So we think if you're the Kurds, it is preferable to fight a war against Assad than for Assad to literally suppress your entirety of your population. But lastly, let us talk about the question of incentives. They say that Americans don't care about conflicts because those conflicts are far away. Yeah, like why are they going to fund humanitarian missions? Because those humanitarian missions are also far away. They also say that America has a strategic incentive, and this strategic incentive isn't altruistic. This is an assumption. Why are strategic incentives inherently a binary between what is good for the people? By their logic, they would oppose trade as well, because all trade happens through economic self-interest. So by their logic, if strategic incentives was that bad of a thing, then they would oppose trade as well. We told you that in many instances, the strategic incentives that side proposition thinks are problematic often align with what is good for the people on the ground. America has a strategic incentive to have stability and democracy, and because they want to have a good reputation, because they want to prop up actors that are predictable, which you only get when you prop up democracies, because authoritarian leaders can do whatever they want with or without American impunity. Therefore, that is a reason as to why America will prop up the right regimes in those areas. And furthermore, you have an incentive not to prop up terrorist groups because terrorist groups are unpredictable. So the choices between funding a terrorist group and funding a democratic actor, you would choose to fund that democratic actor. So their idea of strategic incentive is only a masquerade. They have never proven to you why strategic incentives are inherently diametrical. There will always be the powerful and the powerless, but on our side of the house, we give weapons and the support the powerless need to defend themselves. I am very proud to oppose.
I thank third opposition. I invite opposition reply to conclude the debate for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this? Aid is a very powerless phrase because it means we're not trading with you because we have money to offer to you. We're not demanding because we're not in a geopolitical interest in an authoritarian place where we have control. We're asking for your help, which means on their side of the house, arms still go to people who can afford arms deals. Arms still goes to people who can leverage their trade treaties and tell you we need these things, but they don't go to people who can only ask in our world, we need help, please give us a helping hand. They can assert that we are confusing or point out problems with the world, but proposition just had to answer a few questions that opposition really cared about getting the answers to, and they have not. How? The Kurds that they dismiss as insignificant, if you don't give them guns, how do you expect them to fight against Assad? How the Ukrainian freedom soldiers who just want to defend their own territory, how do you defend them? How do you expect them to push back in Crimea if you only give them training and don't give them the arms that they need? When they don't answer these questions and just flippantly say, well, these people are insignificant, we on-site opposition stand firmly on the grounds that these people's voices and stances still deserve to be protected. There are three questions in this speech. One, their case is entirely symmetrical. And this is what you have to recognize behind the rhetoric that we are confusing, or behind the rhetoric that the world has many problems. Because their problems is that global hegemons have poor incentives that exist on either side of the house, that they will only focus on strategic regions, that they want to stir up conflict, they want to out-alpha each other in geopolitics, that they're opportunists, they're selfish. That exists on either side. So when they support these global hegemons still doing something, like rolling in with training programs or peacekeeping troops, all of these incentives will still actualize on their side of the house. That also means their positive mechanisms are parallel as well. Their backlash on news when you go into horrible wars, that exists when you fund horrible wars as well. So that exists. Their model is also symmetrical because humanitarian aid currently coexists from different funding with military aid. And we told you why humanitarian aid is based on the fact that there's a prerequisite of military aid to secure borders, secure stability. Their second speaker wants to talk about, so humanitarian can even go in. What does opposition give you? A comparison of incentives that China cares about a clean image and US cares more about democracy and stability Italy, more so than Uganda that has been stoning gay individuals, or Syria that has been using chemical weapons on everyday civilians. So when you buy from US and China, or when you buy for the black market, the difference is when we're giving you this aid, we're giving one to the powerless, and two, we can tell you some of this needs to be dedicated to fighting Assad, fighting ISIS, versus when it's black market, all of their negative incentives will just erupt when people can fight whatever wars they want based on their own interests, not based on this type of leverage. Second of all, vulnerable actors. We did not deny their case. The only thing they proved to you is that some bad authoritarian actors are currently funded by a military aid. Yes, in the status quo, they are. They've done thorough impacting on how this aid is bad. But what they didn't prove is if aid is removed, they will still acquire the same weapons through trade because of a few reasons that they did not disprove. One, Saudi Arabia is rich. They can use oil money to get the arms they need. Two, these are strong men who control states, and therefore they have an incentive to build alliances and therefore still give them arms. And three, they can literally build their own weapons. North Korea is not rich, have a low GDP, but they can force people into building nukes anyways. So that is parallel when it comes to harms and the human rights impacting they thoroughly do about how they want to start wars from authoritarian regimes. What they don't answer to is why Kurds and Albanians issues that are very, very much in the minority will be popular enough that Americans will support humanitarian aid or their own men, their own son, their own uncles going in to fight wars for them. That if they themselves say this is a very distant issue, very small issue, why they will do anything at all to peacekeeping these regions, exactly because Americans don't want to sacrifice their own soldiers, their own people. That's why they will do nothing for the Kurds, and the Albanians want to establish Kosovo, and stateless minorities, terrorists are not fought, and new states are not protected. Lastly, on proxy wars, they assert that ending wars are good, but the risk of prolonging a war increases on their side when one accidental injury of an American soldier sent in versus just American money means you have to declare war on their side. But two, when the negotiations happen, negotiations doesn't happen when one side is destroying the other side. They'll just eradicate them completely. It happens when two sides are close in terms of ability, equally funded, and therefore we want to find a way out before it gets out of hand. It comes when there's mutually assured destruction. The USA and China are both involved, and we don't want to erupt into World War III, and therefore we come to the negotiating table. They don't mechanize everything they want to talk about around negotiating wars. But lastly, said opposition says short wars are not necessarily good, because short wars exist when the powerful destroys the powerless, that they don't need to negotiate. They don't even have a fighting chance. The existing structures of imbalance actualize in the fact that they will destroy those who are powerless. Those who are powerful will find their ways to start wars and get weapons. But aid is the last helping hand we can lend to the Kurds we're still so proud to oppose.
I thank opposition reply. I invite proposition reply to conclude the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
So opposition just completely misses the nuance of this debate. Their best claim by the end of third and reply is that rich states get money anyway, so they don't matter. But then they say that, in fact, Saudi Arabia gets better when they have American funds. This ignores the fact that Saudi Arabia, with American funding, is still committing hundreds of human rights abuses and razing Yemen to the ground. You give them more guns and more tanks, they don't have infinite wealth, you are still increasing the scope of the conflict. But furthermore, they also ignore the other examples we gave of Somalia, Eritrea, the dozens of other poor countries who are receiving funding by actors like Gulf states that wouldn't otherwise have the money to do this. Third opposition concedes this. I don't know why these examples and the conflict we are escalating in these countries don't matter to opposition, but the fact is that people are dying and we can avoid it. Two themes in this speech. First, on the alternative, secondly, on the nature of conflict. On the alternative, they keep telling us we have to invade these countries instead. I don't understand why we have to do that. That escalates conflict in the same way that international military aid does. We did say that we supported mechanisms like intelligence sharing, peacekeeping, and joint training. And sure, I agree with Op. This is not a magic wand to stop conflicts, but neither is bankrolling war, and they never explained why their side worked. Opposition gives them bombs that can blow up villages more efficiently, machine guns that will indiscriminately mow down civilians by accident, vast reserves of arms that actually end up strengthening terrorism because they can be used in the aftermath of war. That was the response we gave in second that wasn't taken down. It was just an assertion that giving a country some guns will alleviate suffering, but actually we explained that this often precludes humanitarian aid through escalating conflicts, making it unsafe and undesirable to deliver that aid, which means more suffering for people on the ground when they're not able to access food and medicine. So we never had to explain an alternative for aid, for military aid. We just proved that it does more harm than good, and we win on this alone. But also, this was a weird burden for Op to push on us, because if we prove that military aid creates and escalates conflict, we won't need to see millions of people die before we can ever resolve it. Secondly, then, on the nature of conflict. They keep talking about the Kurds, ignoring the fact that we framed out their main examples about things like rebel groups by explaining that military aid often never goes to non-state actors, as we said in third, because of the same accountability mechanisms that they explain in first op, and because of the risk of alienating allies such as Turkey by funding rebel groups or funding the Kurds. They're powerless, the powerless here then remain powerless, but the oppressors, which are the governments, actually get strengthened. Like, even if they say that they will somewhat go after minorities either way, like they have more accurate machine guns, which is the example that opposition gives, but also billions more dollars to purchase bombers. So people get killed faster and in bloodier ways and to a far larger extent. We also gave you structural analysis as to why the primary givers and recipients of aid would be problematic. Firstly, on strategic interests, that's why we give more money to Israel than the minority groups in Africa being persecuted by Boko Haram. It's because the US cares about one and not the other. Secondly, on economic aims, we have more to gain from Saudi Arabia or Turkey than by funding the Kurds, so we end up funding the actors that are oppressing them instead. But thirdly, we said that these conflicts often don't end because countries fund opposing sides, which means you don't end the conflict, you just escalate it and make it bloodier. So at the end of the day, you escalate conflicts and you fund the oppressors, flipping the opposition case. We also brought up a claim about negotiation, which is when both sides are continuously bankrolled and enriched by state actors, you have no incentive to come to the table. Conflicts end far more slowly. I'd also like to bring our second point back up, which has still not been refuted after the entire opposition case. This was about leverage. We explained that some states like Qatar and the UAE fund opposite sides of the conflict in Somalia. You find the government, for example, and the other side funds Somaliland. These actors both want control over things like shipping routes in the Red Sea, so they actively fund the bombing of the other side. The same thing happens with Russia and Belarus, where it means that Crimea is far more vulnerable. They need to engage with our actual analysis about how we are only strengthening conflict and strengthening oppression onto vulnerable groups. Donors claim to be firefighters, but in reality, they're the arsonists. Proud to propose.
I thank both teams and once again congratulate all on making it to the quarterfinal round of World Schools Debating Championship 2021. I invite the judges to, I actually can't shift breakout rooms.